The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Lessons Learned from the First ECCs to Automate Non-Emergency Calls, sponsored by Aurelian. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping notes to go over. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. You have joined in listen-only mode. This helps avoid background noise throughout the webinar. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free to ask your questions at any time throughout the webinar. The team will answer them throughout the presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please use the question box in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. With that, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. Chris Osworski is the Executive Director of Saginaw County 911 with more than 20 years of leadership in public safety and emergency management. Dedicated to building strong, resilient communities, he has guided countywide 911 services, disaster response efforts, and both regional and statewide initiatives that bring people and agencies together. DT Donaldson has worked at multiple emergency communications centers, large and small, primary and secondary. He now leads MACC 911 in Moses Lake, Washington, where he's driving systems reforms to rebuild 911 from the ground up. Max Keenan is the co-founder and CEO of Aurelian, which helps 911 centers reduce non-emergency call volume so dispatchers can stay focused on real emergencies. Now I'm going to turn it over to Max.
Hi, thanks for having us. And it's ironic that it seems like the tech guy is having the tech issues as I see myself vanishing on and off the screen. Well, I appreciate you all coming out and attending this webinar for us. It's really an exciting time for us because what I really wanted to do was gather DT and Chris, who were really some of the first, if not one of the first agencies in the US to start automating non-emergency calls. I actually think maybe in reality, they're not the true first. I think Jim Lake and Tim Kane out of Arlington and Charleston, South Carolina, respectively, were actually maybe the true first. But I do think it's important to kind of bring these people who have been on the forefront of this technology to help provide some of their insights into the best ways of actually doing this. I had a friend and mentor of mine tell me at one point, he was like, Max, like you're really tough. And you know, you're really great at like running into things and then keep on iterating and trying to fix it. And I was like, thank you. That's really nice of you. And he's like, that wasn't a compliment. Have you like tried to be smarter? And I thought it was really good feedback where it's like, you know, I always like the saying, if you're going to be dumb, you better be tough. But there's probably the better analog of that of like actually just learning from other people's mistakes before you make them yourself. And that was kind of the goal of having this audience together of, hey, can we go out and try to stop some of these mistakes that we've made from other people having them? And so really excited to have Chris and DT here today. So honestly, what I want to do is kind of give us a little bit of background about non-emergency call automation. And then I want the majority of the time to be spent talking to DT and Chris more specifically. So really at a high level, non-emergency call automation for us is three things. So one, it's routing people to the right place. That could be somebody calling because they're trying to figure out, you know, when the court's open. Like everyone's taking one of these calls. How can we get them to the right place without tying up a telecommunicator? The second is triaging for the actual emergencies that come in on the admin line. We notice this is about 5 to 7% of call volume, right? It's people who are calling because their chest hurts, but they don't want lights and sirens. We have to make sure that even though they called the non-emergency line, they got the service that they need. And then the third thing is collecting information for a call for service, right? Could be a stolen wallet, could be a noise complaint, all non-emergent situations that maybe not require, you know, the talents of a telecommunicator, but still require service. And, you know, I'd be remiss, I don't want to harp on this too much because I know everyone knows why we're doing this. But at a high level, the analogy I always like to use is having 911 telecommunicators take admin lines is like like training someone as a Navy SEAL and using them as a mall cop. We have this massive staffing shortage and we have this massive misallocation of talent with 70% or so of non-emergency calls, 70% of total call volume being non-emergency calls. And The reason that automation for the non-emergency line even exists is to reclaim the telecommunicator's time. That's really the entire reason Aurelian exists. It's the entire reason other products in this space exist. And I think in some ways, it's a really exciting claim. Now, for some structure about, I'd say rolling it out, I like to break it down into three major sections. So it's evaluating, like, do we need this? And why do we need this if we do? And what exactly do we expect it to do? I always like, before you start thinking about a project, like, let's set goals and let's actually go and dive in on what success looks like. The second phase is like the actual implementation, which I think DT and Chris can give you two opposite ends on the spectrum of their approach to this and their team's response. And then the third is the actual optimization piece, right? It's, we've done this, it works, how can we make it better? How can we actually measure that return? So, to kind of turn it over to DT and Chris a little bit, I'd love for them each to give backgrounds of their agency and why exactly they personally did this. And DT, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Max. So we're a small to mid-sized agency, about 20 dispatchers, and in the middle of Washington State. And one of the things that I noticed, the staffing crisis, we say we're in crisis, but sometimes we act like it's a staffing coma and we're not actually doing things about it. That when you're in a crisis, you do things differently, right? And so you maybe take a little bit more risk or try different things out. And I know we've been doing that as an industry, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it's a true crisis or we're treating it like a true crisis. So anyway, I went to my board a couple years ago for the 4th of July, right? We get twice as many non-emergency phone calls. Most of them are about just asking questions about fireworks, things like that. So I went to my board, and one of the things about our community is that we have a very good governance, good funding model. We're not too big, not too small. So it bodes well for us to be able to try some things, but that maybe other centers can't. So we're trying to do that on behalf of the industry in some sense. But I went to the board and said, hey, for this 4th of July, can we just turn off non-emergency calls? Just turn them off. And we paid $500 to a web developer on our website, and they built a kind of a dynamic form. You fill out your name and what you needed, and essentially, and when people called, it said, we're not answering right now for today. Please go to our website and fill out a form there, and we'll get to it. So we did that, and I was expecting. So normally, say we get 200, and I know I worked at a big center too, so I know that's not a big number. But say we get 200 non-emergency calls a day, and on 4th of July we get 400. And so we put the system in place, shut off the lines, sent people with the message to go to our website. And I looked at our website, on July 5th in the morning, and we had like five reports that were sitting there that we'd taken. And so I was like, okay, when we turn this phones back on, we're going to get inundated. Now we're going to get not only the calls for July 4th, but the calls for July 5th too. But basically nothing happened. We didn't get any additional call volume. So what that told me is that no one wants to make a report online. At least in our community, no one was going to do that. So then we started looking at rule-based AI, which is the old-fashioned AI, and that's where you have to have something mapped to a back like database. So for example, someone sitting on my chest, generative AI, which is the new AI, understands what that means. That's a medical issue. You have chest pain, but if you say it feels like an elephant sitting on my chest to the old AI, you'd have to map that in a diagram to that means chest pain or something like that. So it doesn't understand. And so we went down that road, paid a lot of money, a lot of time, months and months of work developing that. And that's some of these other pioneers in the space were working with what they had at the time, which is rule-based AI. And we just never got there, never got to a place where it was going to work for us. It wasn't going to be a good customer experience. It was too clunky. And because we're trying to get rid of all non-emergency calls. Again, that was our goal from the get-go. I don't want to siphon off 10% or 20% because for a large center, that's good. But for our small center like ours, it doesn't do us much good. And so about that time, I met Max, and generative AI came out, right? It's only been out since I think November 2022 to the masses on a commercial scale, and kind of the rest is history there. But it does exactly what we wanted, what we've been trying to do that whole time, which was remove those non-emergency calls from the workload of our dispatchers so they can focus on other things like true emergencies.
Yeah, I guess DT, kind of diving into that a little bit more. Like, I'd love to just hear, like, where were you guys at with staffing? So obviously you want to reduce non-emergency call volume. Like, what percentage of your calls were actually non-emergency calls versus 911 calls?
So at our center, it actually changes a little bit, whether it's wintertime, the slow season, or summertime, but 50 to 60%, which I think is pretty average of our calls are to the non-emergency line. Now, on top of that, there's probably 50% of our calls to the 911 line that are not emergency either. And we can also transfer those people from 911 to the AI system for handling non-emergency calls. So I guess depending on how you want to look at it, it's anywhere from minimal 50 to 75% or even more of our call volume. But the ones that come in on our line, our non-emergency line, it's about 50 to 60%. And I didn't feel that aligned with, we're emergency telecommunicators. I didn't feel that aligned with our mission, which is, yes, it's important to handle the barking dog calls, but I don't know why that's been dumped on us over the years, which I guess that's a fine place to have it. But a human doesn't. I noticed that we're taking name, phone number, location, brief description. Name, phone number, location, brief description. That's work that's ripe for AI. AI chews that up and eats that easily over and over again, thousands and thousands of times a day. And the dispatchers, one more barking dog call, give me just one more parking complaint, and they're out the door.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so where were you guys at staffing wise in terms of missing people versus full-time at that time?
Our staffing was actually okay. I see it more, I saw it more at the time as it is a staffing multiplier, but I saw it more as a burnout multiplier. Yeah. We're down like everyone else. We're probably down 20%. But we've also increased our staffing. We just haven't been able to fill it. So we don't have what we need for sure. But for me, it was more of the burnout angle for the telecommunicators. And it's been huge in that regard.
And I always think, so when we first met, so I think the reason I ended up reaching out to you specifically when we were just exploring this space at the time was I saw that you were like adopting new tech with Carbine. You had just gone to cloud-based call handling, or you had just started that process at the time I'd reached out. And one of the things I think I was just so lucky to meet you about was this: you had this goal of not automating 20%, but automating 100%, which I think is crazy in a lot of ways. I still think it's a little bit crazy, but I think it was like the right amount of crazy that we needed. Like, why did you set out with such an aggressive goal? And why were you not fine with like 20 or 30%?
Well, remember we started from just shut it all down. I mean,
Sure.
Obviously send people to an online form, not literally shut it all down, but that's where it started. So that was the mindset from the get-go. But I think, if you're a large center, again, siphoning off 20% of your calls is a big deal. But and I saw that some of the other centers, maybe the ones you mentioned, I think there's this agency in Colorado also that was kind of pioneering the rule-based AI. And I just wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and move forward, because for us, especially being a smaller center, I mean, most of those calls that we got, the doubling of calls on the 4th of July, because obviously we get calls on the 911 line. That's not what we're talking about here. But on that non-emergency line, they're not value added for the community. Somebody asking when fireworks are legal, they can go to a website and look that up. I mean, or AI can just tell them on the phone, no problem. But that's not adding. We're not adding value to the community by answering that question in a public safety sense.
Yeah, and then can you talk a little bit about like your actual user agencies, because you're a consolidated center that covers the entirety of Grant County, Washington.
Yeah, we're so large geographic area, 3,000 square miles, but only 100,000 population, so pretty rural here. Like I said, I worked at other centers, larger centers, but it's a very rural, very, very rural community. But we dispatch police, fire, medical, probably similar to other agencies like us. 14 police departments, 20 fire districts. And then a couple EMS ambulance providers. So I think we're pretty standard, quote unquote. We are under our own. We're a special district, so we're not under a police department, under a sheriff's office or fire department.
Yeah. And then Chris, I'd love some background on Saginaw.
Yeah. So background Saginaw, we're low staff like everyone. I started about 3 years ago. We were low staff then. We continue to be. So for us, fully staffed is 30. We're down 13. And I get not giving up on fully staffed, but shooting for appropriately staffed, right? And just working through that like everyone else is tough. And so looking at staffing and considerations for staffing, I don't look at it as it's outside in first. And so it's not an acute problem. I look at this as we're going to be struggling with staffing no matter what industry you're in for a long time, right? Just look at the numbers. There's 11,000 people turning 65 every day in the United States, right? And so there's a lot of people retiring out of the workforce, and it puts pressure on, for there's a lot more competition for folks who are looking for employment, and that our industry it's a tough industry, right? And Saginaw is a tough place to work, or a hard place to work, but a rewarding place to work, and that leads to a lot of turnover with trainees getting through the program, and just leads to, as everyone knows, just can be hard. And so for myself, we were already kind of looking at, when I came on, kind of implementing some assistive technology, using some retrieval augmented generation where you can define, a document, and then you can do a search on that with the mental model as don't know where everything is at, but know how to get to something. Let's make it easy to get to for a dispatcher. So we're already kind of using some different generative AI technology in the center. And then somehow you and I got to meet. We were just talking about that a bit ago. And so my understanding of what generative AI could be, moving forward, and really understanding, hey, I want to take this technology, start to implement this technology in different ways to help, the center surf the wave instead of drown with this AI, kind of revolution that's happening right now. And so, hey, we've had some success with generative AI, using it around the edges. And when I saw Aurelian, I thought, hey, this is something that could help us. And so taking that approach, we said, okay, let's see if we can start implementing this technology in the center. And we did it. We took the leap, having conversations with Max and Aurelian. We said, okay, we're going to try this. We have to try different approaches in new things, because the mental model of this is not an acute staffing issue that's just a year or two. This is something that's going to be prolonged for our industry. And how do we provide tools to our hardworking dispatchers to ensure that we're providing value to the community, making their jobs maybe easier, and make this a job, that rewarding job, fulfilling job that people want to continue to do. And so looking at this as an option is something we wanted to try.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then can you talk a little bit about like the community that you serve with Saginaw County more generally? Because I think it's very different than DTs.
Yeah, very different. And so we're a population right around 200,000 people. We have an urban core, and so in the city of Saginaw, and then outside of the city of Saginaw, we have it's rural too. So it's really a microcosm of a whole host of different factors. To demographics, we're older population, but we also have a lot of violent crime in our community as well. So we're definitely we're a very diverse place, and so it leads to unique challenges for us within the community and within the dispatch center.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's actually funny. The day, I don't think you know this, the day we went live was exactly a year ago today.
Was it really? Oh my gosh.
Yep. August 26th. So
right.
Perfect timing. Couldn't be better.
Time flies. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the background. I think it's helpful to kind of set the scene, because I think on many ends, you guys are kind of different sides of the spectrum, like both authorities in some sense, consolidated centers covering multiple jurisdictions, which I think might be part of the reason the non-emergency call volume burden is larger. But I also think that it's a little bit interesting seeing how you guys have entirely different demographics. I think the very first call we took, or one of the very first calls we took for you, was a shooting.
Yes. Yeah.
On the non-emergency line. It was somebody who said, I think I just shot somebody, or I was just shot.
Yeah, I was just
shot. That
shot.
was the very first non-emergency call. And then I remember hearing all the 911 calls come in after that one.
Yeah.
Very different than Grant County, Washington, in some degrees.
And some of those, like some of the things and lessons, things we learn right off, because we do have dispatch for multiple agencies. And so how things are handled in the city for specific call types are way different than a smaller agency that's outside of the city. And so those are things that we had to navigate and build on within the system. So we had to be very thoughtful when we built a lot of that out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then kind of thinking about one of the things that I think, it's interesting. I think DT, I think you had done this a little bit informally of trying to figure out like, why are people even calling the non-emergency line? Because I think it's hard. A lot of these calls don't necessarily create a call for service. So how do you actually kind of keep track of it? And I think it seemed like I'd love to hear about your process here when you were thinking about like when you were trying the rules-based AI solution you were working with, to when we actually started implementing Aurelian.
So I want to go back and answer one of the other questions you asked earlier, as far as why 100% of the calls, and I think looking through it from a mental health or burnout lens for the dispatchers, for our staff, I don't want to get rid of 20% of their burnout, right? I mean, I want to get rid of 100% of their burnout. So that's why the incremental wasn't going to work for me. 5%, 10%. Let's get them help and support that they need now, because this was a great product. And one of the things, I mean, looking at the list here, I mean, I was surprised like how many animal calls we get. I think that might even be higher in some cases, but in a rural community, we get a lot of animal calls, and officer messages, which is just somebody calling to want to speak to an officer. Like, we're literally acting as an answering machine in those cases. And so, but what we found was that with going back to the rules base, which is again, 2002 or 2022, sorry, it's very hard to, I mean, your list starts getting very big because you have to specify everything, whereas generative just understands native, context and understands natively. So the list was just getting too big, or it wasn't going to handle, it was only going to handle 50% of what we needed. And so that's why we had to look out for another solution when we found you. But
because I think one of the things that
it handles all of these just, or generative AI handles all of these. And you could make this list 1,000 more, and it would handle all of those fine as well.
That was one of the big realizations we had early on with your implementation, right? Which was, we were kind of hoping that 3 or 4 or 5 things was going to be 60% of call volume. And like the reason why the rules-based might work for like Delta Airlines is that really only people call about 3 things, right? It's like booking a flight, complaining about a flight, canceling a flight. It's probably 90% of their calls. But for you guys, like we realized pretty quickly on that to get to even 80% call automation, it's probably going to be hundreds of things. And some of them were going to be used like one-off, right? I think, Chris, the one that was really top of mind for me that we realized early on was fire hydrants.
Yeah. The hydrants was amazing how often, those calls are coming in, and we found a way to automate those, working with Aurelian. The other one too is just the number of officer call-ins, right? Surprised me. I knew that in our center, we had a significant number of times our officers are calling into dispatch, but until we did the analysis, we didn't realize like how many. And in doing that analysis, I think helped us shape the call routes, what we were going to use Aurelian for, how we were going to incorporate Aurelian, work around Aurelian with officers, making sure that they could come direct into the center when they needed to. And understanding like this long tail of different calls too, and how often was super important, because there's just the variety, as everyone knows, is there's so many different call types that you would deal with on the non-emergency line. So in some ways, like 911 calls, it's very specific. There's less divergence, and like there's not a long thin tail of random one-offs that happens on the non-emergency line. So understanding, on that tail, the thick part of the tail, and what call routes we should build and which ones we shouldn't, and spend some time on was important too. And then that built into also the conversation with the risk tolerance and what calls do you want to bring into the center, based on the conversation through with Aurelian and the generative AI, and which ones you're fine, deflecting and the dispatcher not even having a conversation at all with, and which ones do you want Aurelian to kind of put together for the dispatcher to take further action on. And all of that kind of was easier to understand after we did a lot of that analysis of the calls.
It's funny you mentioned that. I think one of the biggest takeaways from our implementation I learned was we sat down and we showed you kind of a little bit of a chart similar to this about why people are calling. And the very first thing you said to me is, I wish you showed this to me 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And that kind of sparked like a lot of what we do now. I'm like, hey, can we look at this before we even sign a contract? And we can set expectations. We can figure out why people are calling you. We can figure out the possible impact we can have. Because I think in your case, one of the things that surprised us was like 30 or 40% of call volume was officers.
Yeah, for sure.
And so unless we were going to, one, start taking officer calls, which we talk about sometimes like non-compliant callers, people that don't want to use the system. Officers are by far the most non-compliant callers, like the bar none. But yeah, I think that having those expectations before you even pick a vendor, before you even start this process, is really valuable. And then one thing you talked about, both of you guys kind of talked about the long tail, like the idea that the remaining 80% of your calls might come from 100 plus different things. Do you think that's like, and I know DT, you worked at, Portland, which is more of a city specific center. You worked at consolidated centers. Do you find that true for all types of centers, or is that just consolidated centers?
I know some centers have, separate 311 and things like that, but I kind of, to Chris's point earlier, I don't know how to answer your question exactly, but no, non-emergency line gets everything, right? Every single thing you could ever think of comes, even emergency, like we talked about. Emergencies come in on the non-emergency line, but also everything, anything you can think of will come in there. So yeah, I mean, that tail is extremely long.
Yeah, and I think like one of my favorite things about some of these, like especially these early implementations, was like we went in this with like no idea of how this was actually going to necessarily progress. And now obviously we built out more structure, but like for example, like with the fire hydrants, right? Like we saw like, hey, I think it was somewhere around 2,000 calls a year were coming in from Public Works about fireworks. And I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was one of your dispatchers, one of your supervisors had come up to me and was like, hey, why don't we just do this as like an online form? Like, why are these people even calling?
Yeah.
And to me, that was one of my favorite things, because something we'd never even thought about, right? Like we'd never even considered this idea.
Yeah, there's not just the cost for us, there's the cost for the municipality who's calling us too. And I just, that person having to call multiple times a day with that same information. And so there's the cost there for that community. And then there's the cost for us as well. And so there's double the cost on that call on both sides. And to automate that, they just type it into that form and it drops right into it really. And it saves time on both ends.
I think that's like a good, like one of the ways that my understanding of the non-emergency line has evolved is it's not just how the community interacts with law enforcement or with your user agencies. It's also like that, how like it's vice versa too, right? It's how you're able to provide information. It's really a two-way street in many ways. Yeah, jumping in our next slide. So one of the big things, we hit on this a little bit, was just categorizing, like, could you actually solve these calls? Like we talked about this with Chris, like, hey, we can't solve these officer calls. Like we're probably going to have to forward these officer calls in if they're asking for NCIC, things like that. So setting that expectation of what the impact actually could be early on.
Well,
the other
sorry. Okay. Yep. I was going to say one thing that we did was we chose the dispatchers and we got together and chose which calls we don't want to go automated, that we do want to come a human. One of those was a calls for the coroner, and that's usually someone calling, say, my husband, wife of 50 years just died. We wanted them to talk to a person, and just by choice. And then like missing, or not missing person, but welfare checks. We could change it tomorrow if we wanted to, but right now we have those come to a person because just the nature of those calls. So we found certain natures that even though they could be automated easily, we chose to have them come through.
Yeah, makes sense. And then jumping in, I actually think the one thing I've learned is I think the change management piece and how the concept of this project and the outcomes of this project are communicated to the telecommunicators is probably the most important part of implementing any project. And I think that like from the get-go, I would say in some ways like the approach to this was a little bit different between you two in some ways. So I'd love to hear like, maybe starting with DT very quickly, like you've been talking about this with the team for a while. How'd you inform them? How'd you keep them up to date? How'd you get their buy-in?
Well, we started with that, shutting off the phones on the 4th of July. And so they saw the impact of that. I mean, that's an immediate impact where all of a sudden your call volume, which you expected to double, now halves on one of the busiest days of the year. So I think they saw that. So that was a visceral, real life example where they saw the power of what this could be. We'd already been working on the rule-based until that kind of failed. But so I think they were kind of along for months already and had a good example to see, to understand where this would go. Because I know a lot of people, we always talk in hypotheticals in this industry, and I don't know, a lot, like almost too much. instead of just trying stuff. And I think the modern way to do things, especially with something like non-emergency line, like just try it. Why would you not just try it? Now, again, maybe not with 911 calls or something like that, but there's some low-hanging fruit that we could absolutely try.
Yeah. And then how was your team, from day one? Would you say they're pretty receptive?
So I had several, maybe 10% who were opposed to it, completely opposed to it. What about elderly people who called was one of the arguments. What about people calling with emergencies on the non-emergency line? And those have been non-issues whatsoever. But yeah, and after we went live with it, probably we had full true believers that, try to say that 100%, true believers about anything at your 911 center, even if it's what kind of dessert to bring in or what, anything, any topic whatsoever. And we had, I would say 100%, and that's just not me as a director. Like I met with people one-on-one, and to a person, it was a game changer for them. It was a huge impact. So even the naysayers became the biggest advocates actually after that.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, I feel like they had a little bit of a different reception. I don't think it was as warm of a welcome in many ways.
No, it wasn't. So I think today you have like small percentages, tepid acceptance of the system, and still a lot of folks who, kind of loathe it, the automation process. And I think every person has their own reasons, kind of why that they feel the way that they do on the system. But I would say like lessons learned from my perspective is the first one we implemented, and I didn't really understand like the it's not radical, I guess, but the change in the way we process this call moves from, you call the phone call to more data analyst. And so as far as like change management, I kind of discounted how different it would be to process this data.
Yeah.
Not over the phone, via voice, when someone's highly skilled and trained and taking this all through, all auditory information for the most part. And now they have to review and analyze and make decisions. That's a different skill set. And so I think from my perspective, I kind of discounted that and didn't really understand that until we implemented. And so we implemented, and it was rocky. You remember this, Max. And then we kind of stopped and considered that phase one. We regrouped, made some changes, working with your team, and then brought Max and the team on site. Really spent a lot of time with each individual dispatcher, how the system works, the process of taking the kind of the call from start to finish, how it works, and that helped. I really think that can't be underplayed. It is much different than how we would normally process this call, and so giving that thought was, I think, important to do. The other one that became really apparent is that like the system is, in some sense, processes this based on the route you develop. And if you have inconsistencies on how your policies and procedures are perceived, maybe nights to days or shift to shift, that's going to then perceive if this call was a failure or not within the Aurelian system. And to some perspective, one perspective, like the automation, the generative AI doesn't discriminate. This is the way I built this route, and this is how I'm going to process this call. But so it's not the fault of the system, it's the fault within the center itself, because there's two different ways this call would be handled, maybe depending on the shift or nights to days and things like that. So we quickly learned, hey, there's policies and procedures that we had to tighten up to make sure that the call was processed the right way, both.
Yeah, I think that was like, this is a good lesson because you were between my, let's say my second and my third implementation. And so like with DTs, in many ways, it set me up for failure with Chris, I'd say, because it was so easy. We didn't have any test period. We just went live with it, and it worked pretty well day one. And then we shifted gears entirely, and we figured it was going to be exactly the same. And what we found was that very quickly, every single center is very different, and they handle things very differently. Their relationship with their user agencies is very differently. Their relationship with the community is very different, and the reasons people are calling is very different. And like one of the things you mentioned, like the SOP variants, I remember we had kind of built the system so that somebody could request officer contact by phone. And then I remember half of the staff was like, no, we never offer phone calls. Like they're gonna visit in person. And like that was kind of like a stark contrast that we'd never really even thought about. And then that kind of had us build like another depth of maybe variance in how the system actually functioned. Do you have any like high level recommendations for people considering this?
I would say when it comes to that, like make sure your policies are tight and right and consistent. Look at the, if you're if you're dispatching for multiple agencies, looking at how, the specific, call types that how they're going to be dispatched and how that would affect you. So for instance, in the city of Saginaw, there's specific call types that is going to be just a report call, and they're actually going to go out, the resident will go online and fill out a form, but that's handled way differently in maybe a township over. And so understanding those differences within those specific call types and how they're handled is super important to think those through, because then you have to really say, okay, it's coming in from this location, we're going to treat it this way, and we're going to route that call for the outcome in a much different way than we would be at this location. So really giving those things some thoughts about not only the policies and procedures and preparing your folks, but also taking a look at how you actually handle those call types in those different agencies if you dispatch from multiple agencies. That's super important.
So,
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm going to counter Chris on that. And we're baking cakes here when we get to 10,000 calls, 50,000 calls, all of that, and our system is the dispatcher of the year, voted by the dispatchers. But my counter to that would be, it's easy to implement this because unlike everything else we do with 911 or CAD or any of those things, you could put this in place and turn it on just on the 4th of July or just during your busy hour, or you could tweak it and you could turn it off for today, and then while you're tweaking it, turn it back on. There's really no risk here in my opinion. So I'm more of the iterative, like let's figure it out, try things. I'm see the RFPs that stack up, like encyclopedias, and by the time it's done being written, it's all obsolete technology anyway today. So I think this is an easy place to just try stuff where we can't do that in most other things we do. But to your point, yeah, if you're going to go all in, you're going to have to figure. It does help you shore up your policies, and it's done the same for us as well. It's helped us refine our policies and procedures. But I would say there's very little risk to just implementing something, because again, you could turn it on every second Tuesday of the month, or whatever you want to do.
And to speak to your point on risk, is that as long as you go into it understanding what your risk tolerance is, the routes that you build are based on your risks, and say, okay, for these call types, this is how I'm going to handle it, and for these, I'm just going to have them roll back into the 911 center. So you can kind of build your own risk profile, for lack of a.
Yeah, I like that idea of like tolerable risk. Like the intolerable risks to me is like, one, having an emergency that isn't properly detected.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably like the only, in my mind, like, well, maybe not only, one of the very few like truly intolerable risks in this space. It's like we need to make sure that we have like full accuracy on the emergency detection piece. And I'd rather obviously err on the side of caution than not. But this is also part of the reason why I wanted to get you both together, is because I feel like you have exactly on the opposite ends of that. And then so one of the things that we got a question for as well is like, what steps how did you, I know like DT, you went in with this full polarized approach before we existed of turning off the line. Like, how did your user agencies respond to that? And then how did your user agencies respond to our system?
So, I'll give a quick analogy. I was outside of, I worked as an 911 dispatcher, then I left that field and I was doing a job going to a job interview just at a different field. And they asked me like, how do you deal with stress? And I said, how can you handle stress? I said, I was an 911 dispatcher, and said, all right, next question. They didn't even ask me any other questions about that whatsoever. They just said, we're good, we're moving on. And I think the same thing here with our user agencies. You say, you don't need to tell anybody that dispatchers we're understaffed, or dispatchers are, burned out or anything like that. So if you say, hey, this is going to help our dispatchers, I think you'll generally get buy-in, unless you have a horrible governance or horrible leadership, which I know some centers unfortunately have that, but usually when it's under a police department or fire department. But I think that people get it. So they definitely understood that, we can't double our calls on the 4th of July and expect our staff to handle that. Like I think everyone got that. So That wasn't too much of a buy-in. Now with the Aurelian, once we went with Aurelian, we did have some complaints from the community. Some people just don't like, we call them robophobic. They just don't like talking to robots, period, no matter what, no matter how good it is or anything, they just don't like it. And so what we did was they were kind of complaints were trickling through to our user agencies. And so, the records clerks, the front staff at their departments. And so I got the command staff together from the police agencies and so and the record staff. And we had about 30 people on a Teams call. I had a Teams call with everyone. And I said, all right, I did a little slideshow and said, here's the number to call. So we have a separate number you can call test calls, right, instead of the live system. So you can make test calls of this, but it works just like the live system. Here's a list of 50 things. You can make a barking dog complaint. You can make say you're having an emergency. Do whatever, say whatever you want. And use your real name, use a fake name. Just pretend you're a caller. And I gave them all 5 minutes in this Teams call, like everyone go 5 minutes, make your own phone call. And so they all made a phone call, all 30, 35 people that were on this Teams meeting. They came back after about the 5 minutes and I said, okay, what's your feedback? No one said anything. A couple of people said, no, it's fine. Basically everyone was like, oh, it was fine. It worked just fine. And mind you, this is 6 months ago and AI's gotten a lot better even in the last 6 months. It's probably more than 6 months ago. So it's even better now, but even then it was fine. So when they actually made a test call themselves and experienced it themselves, there weren't any issues. And so then they realized that maybe the people complaining to them were just complainers. And we all understand there are such things as just complainers as well.
And then on this crawl, walk, run side. So DT, you went no stretching, full sprint, no warm up at all. I actually don't recommend this for any other agencies. I think this is unique to you.
I will say the months and months and months we spent on the rules.
There's a lot of testing. That's true.
It was part of our learning curve.
But yeah, I would say it was very quick into the sprint. And then, Chris, I think we were a little bit more iterative with how we started. And can you talk about kind of those factors that we added on to and how we made sure that it was, in a safe manner?
Yeah, so for us, very similar to DT's experience for external agencies, we communicated with them and explained, hey, this is what we're going to implement. We want to take some of that load off the dispatchers if possible for some of those admin calls that are non-emergent. And so we kind of communicated all of that. I say one thing, lesson learned, is that because we do have so many officer calls, is to make sure that those are whitelisted ahead of time. And then we offered create a backdoor within the system. So there's essentially a passphrase that officers and firefighters and EMTs, first responders can say to get through AVA if they need to just get right to a dispatcher. So kind of putting those things in place really helped because there is resistance, right? There's resistance in the community. So for us, we were not 100% resistance. We've had it low, we've kept it low. And some of that is just the expectations in our community. Like you said, the very first call we received was a shooting call. And so making sure that we work with MACC's team to make sure any kind of perception of an emergency, those calls present front and center, they get dispatched or transferred to the center, and they also, the dispatchers see that call. We knew that was super important for us. And then we've kept that friction low, that resistance low, so that way if someone wants to talk to a person, there's friction built in for us, but it's not as DT has like so much friction that you wouldn't get to a dispatcher. Those individuals who say person or dispatcher, eventually, after a couple of attempts, they're going to transfer through to the dispatcher as well. So we different setup, but same outcomes.
And did you have any resistance from elected officials on hey, we think that people they should call and get a person, less so about maybe any of the perception of quality and more so about, hey, we just think they should get a person?
I didn't get any of that. I fielded a few conversations, of course, with first responders for that concern, but not from elected officials or government officials. Occasionally inquiries of how does this work? We were so early, a lot of it was education. People are so used to the press 1, press 2, and so they thought they were going to get that really robotic experience if they're talking to their, to some sort of call center that's automated. if you're trying to get a hold of, I don't know, your cable company, and explaining, no, that's not how this is. It's more conversational. So because we were so early with that, there was some of that education to do. But once somebody actually had a conversation with it, I still see, because I listen to a number of calls every week just to kind of audit the system, and sometimes the conversations, it's funny because the person who's calling will just have a conversation with Ava, and they're getting what they need, but they're getting time to have a conversation where maybe we wouldn't have had that time if it was a really busy center for them. And so there's some of that's surprising sometimes to me, where the interaction will be very, very fluid, very casual, almost as if that the person's kind of just comfortable having a conversation with Ava, presenting the information that they need. It might be a 2 or 3 minute conversation where that person wanted to extrapolate and give additional information that maybe we wouldn't have had time for because the center is so busy at that point. So in a sense, it's weird to say this, but during those peak periods, Ava is allowing for us to give a great service when we're too busy to maybe even answer that phone call.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then to move in, I know I'd like to save some time for questions. So keep thinking about this at a high level. Like we talked about community engagement a lot, right? I'd say like at a high level, what was the feeling? Like, was the community receptive? How'd you manage the expectations? Like one of the things I talk about and why I kind of like the approach of low resistance, like easy ability for the caller to get through if they want. So at the end of the day, like our caller is actually the customer, right? Not really, it's kind of coincidental that you guys are the ones who buy and implement, but the caller is the one that pays our bills. And so like we have to make sure that caller has a great experience. I'd be curious, like what was your thoughts on PR? Did you think like a public awareness campaign was going to be useful? Did you try anything in that regard?
I guess we tried a couple of public education campaigns. I don't know if it reaches a lot of our community. Everyone's on different platforms now, and there is no common platform really, even in a rural community. So we tried, but I don't know how much of impact that had. And of course, comments on social media, the fact that they tend to skew negative is no surprise to any of us whatsoever. And so I just look at, we do send people a survey as part of the system. We send them a survey, and those have been 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 positive to negative. And I think that's actually skewed because most people, I think, that will leave a comment would skew negative in general. So if that makes any sense, I think it's actually skewed more positive because we don't get more negative that you would expect people when they're mad, as opposed to, oh, it was good, but they're not necessarily going to take the time to just fill out a survey. But anyway, at this point, we're over 80,000, probably 90,000 calls, and that's a lot of. I mean, that's not a lot of calls for a big center, but I mean that's enough of material to say this works pretty well. Like, this works pretty well. Even if you had a couple hundred people who didn't like it out of 80,000, that's not bad. I mean, we had people that didn't like the dispatchers either when they took the calls, right? So it's a good system. So I don't know if the community, everyone's kind of just used to it. Either they're going to hate it, or they're like, everyone knows the AI is coming. Chris and I didn't invent AI. You didn't invent AI. I mean, it's coming.
Yeah.
How do we leverage it to help our people in our community?
And what about like the Spanish-speaking community specifically? Because I know obviously Grant County is a large Spanish-speaking community. Yeah,
that's been great. 50% of our population speaks Spanish, roughly 40% actually speak Spanish, and it's totally seamless. So whereas in the past we would have had to give them different service than everyone else because we would have had to wait to call a person, interpreter, and all of that, and make their call 2 or 3 times longer. It handles that seamlessly, and then our dispatchers retranslate back from them so they can see exactly what was said, and that's been great. So there's no longer a language barrier from the non-emergency perspective.
Yeah, and then just to summarize, so basically the PR approach was tried a few things, didn't feel like it had a massive reach, and then now you're actively sending surveys to elicit feedback. Is that the right term? For the community proactively?
Solicit feedback, yeah.
Solicit, yeah. Sorry. I think Chris, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, Chris, my experience, Max, is really similar to DT's in the sense that we did. I think we put out a couple of press releases. Saying we're implementing this, so there's some community awareness. There was some pickup in local media, but that's all we did. We didn't know, we weren't sure how much to do. So we just want to make sure that there was out there, there was some awareness, and then we would turn it on because it was so early. I think the farther we get into this people adding AI to lots of other things, it becomes, more normal. I think DT said that the other day is, if this was 2 years ago, this is really new, and now it's becoming more and more normal almost every day as it gets as people utilize this more and more. So we were early, didn't know the best approach. So we just put out some media and just said, okay, we will set our resistance low. So in case someone wanted to get to hold of someone or started pressing 0 again and again and again, they would get to a dispatcher. And so, but as far as like a lot of feedback, I haven't had a lot of feedback either way, I would say.
How would you recommend, if someone was going to do this now, would you recommend them to do PR? Because I think this is something we flip-flop on.
For me, I would say no, just something out there to make the community aware, to put it out, if media picks it up, things like that. But I don't think you need a really big launch with this technology, just because once you put it out, your customers will start to, they're going to utilize it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I like to think of it as just like an evolution of a call tree. Like a lot of centers already have a call tree. This is the next step. So it's like, would you put out a press release if you started using a call tree?
Yeah, we already had our IVR in place, and we just took the IVR away and put the gender of the IVR in place is kind of what we did.
And this is 10 times better than a call tree.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. You don't want to have to press 0 to repeat all the options again.
No.
And then, so kind of going in, we talked about a little bit like measuring value. We'll skim over this. I think really what it boils down to me is 3 things. Like, what percent of calls you're automating? How much time is that saving your telecommunicators? And then the third note is, if you do have a wait time, like how much time are you actually saving in wait time for the caller? Like, I think that is like an important metric to think about. The other thing I want to touch on, I know we've got 8 minutes, is DT, you hinted on like the relationship with us being very different than the relationship between like maybe a call handling vendor, maybe a CAD vendor. Like, what are some of the things that you would think about when choosing a vendor? What would you optimize for?
So I don't look at, I talk about the big RFP stack that people write. I don't look at it like that anymore. I look at what's the underlying platform and what's the level of service. That's all I care about, because the way technology can move now, if I'm on the right platform and I have the right level of service, people that were willing to iterate, and if I ask for a feature, they can provide that feature in a reasonable amount of time. It doesn't matter if it's missing 10 features that another company has right now, because I'll get that next month or the month after that, and then plus more. So, and I avoid all the headache too. So a very responsive vendor, and on a platform that works, and that's a future facing platform. So those are the only 2 things I care. We've actually done that recently with everything we buy, is just look at those 2 things. And I don't even, this sounds maybe my approach, right, that compared to Chris's approach, but I don't even really write RFPs anymore. I just look for those 2 things.
And then like the fully managed versus self-service. Like, is this something you think you could have managed on your own? Like, I just saw your very talented tech manager, Garrett Klein, behind us.
Back in the window here, or window order. Yeah, he could have handled it. We'll tell him that. We'll throw him a bone there. He definitely could have handled it, but he doesn't have the time to handle it. But the fact that we could still do stuff if we needed to in a pinch is great. So it's kind of the best of all worlds. It's, white glove service, but you can also do stuff on your own if you need to. So I think that's the best hybrid.
Yep, that makes sense. And then Chris, you lead Michigan's Shark Tank, where you see these vendors head to head, like last month. Like, what are the things that you think are most important for someone considering a solution in this space to consider?
I think the solution in this space, first, generative AI in general. I think choosing a platform with the knowledge of, I don't want to purchase whatever this application or this platform is. If in 6 months some sort of OpenAI's ChatGPT 6 kind of eats that application, so you have some edge case that just, if it's a specific user case, and then as the models get better, there's no reason to have that. And so choosing something that, like one of this platform, where as the model gets better and is able to access more tools, then the platform itself gets better. So as this technology grows and becomes better, the tool, the platform you're using gets better as well. And so that's a consideration I think that everyone should be putting in their mind, is is that. And so this is one of those cases. As the models get better, as DT indicated, the technology keeps getting better. It's going to make this call handling system, this automated call handling system, better. And so that's one of the things I think about when implementing any form of kind of AI. Is it as it lifts as the AI gets better, is this product going to get better along with it? Thinking of that. The other thing to thinking about is the iterative approach of how to build out the routes. Someone told me a long time ago, if you've been in one dispatch center, you've been in one dispatch center. And so that's important of whatever vendor you choose. There's no cookie cutter routes. There's a few, right? Maybe animal control and some other ones. Even that, maybe not, because like
some places for business hours.
Yeah, it's all complex, right? So whomever you choose in this space, it's a handshake. The PSAP needs to be prepared to understand which routes they want to build out, and how, and then Aurelian or whomever needs to be ready and able to build out those routes. They're essentially, a lot of them are custom, right? And so it's an iterative conversation approach with the vendor and with the PSAP to get those routes correctly, so you get a successful outcome on the back end of that call. So I think that's really, really important. And then the managed versus self-service, in my mind, I guess you could do this. I built some routes initially, and but to optimize those routes for consistency, we found it was great to have that conversation. This is what I want. This is the expectation of how I want this call handled. Please build this route in the best way for me. And I think that's super important. We can still build something out if we need it. So yeah, it's important.
I think one thing that surprises me is like how often, because we get feedback from the telecommunicators, how often we're still making changes, like a year plus in. Like that, I think I was hoping personally that we'd be making fewer changes, but like things evolve. I almost like to think of it as like having a new trainee, right? Where you have to keep them apprised of all the new things that come into the center, and you have to make sure that's updated with all of that new information.
It's so dynamic. Every call, you're dealing with people. And so there's so many edge cases, and every call is unique and different because every person and every situation is unique and different. We're dealing with people, and that's hard. So this has to be a dynamic kind of spot to be. And then I think the 24/7 support is important. If we need to change, we reach out and it needs to happen. And then the ability to have like emergency routing, which we're using now dynamically if we need it during storm events and things like that. And then working with whatever vendor you choose, you want to make sure there's 24/7 support. You need to build a route on the fly or something like that.
I always think about it. It's like, it is the non-emergency line, but I still like to think of it as mission critical software, because it really is the number one way people interact with law enforcement and public safety generally. So I know we've interweaved some questions then, but I did want to leave a second for any questions anyone else might have. So as they come in, one of the questions, I know we hinted on this a little bit, but was there any deterioration in the relationship with departments in the PSAP?
I would say no. Again, they all know we're understaffed. They all know, no one's going to argue that. No one's going to argue that. I would hope not. No one's going to argue that they're not burned out. Like, they get it. They understand it. Now, again, what level of friction you set? Our level of friction is, you can't press 000, say human, and get to human. We don't allow that, but you easily could. And so, if there is some friction, you can rebalance that pretty easily with your user agencies. We've chosen to keep it up this level. We have safe listed all their numbers so they can get through to us, and that helped a lot. But so I guess we have done some balancing there, but you can balance it to where everyone's comfortable.
And then one last question, and we'll end on this one, was having the AI system in place, has that changed your training process? How do you train people for non-emergency calls if they're not taking them?
Well, I will say that, I'll just answer real quickly. They can start before, our trainees kind of dead weight for the first 3-4 months. Now within, the first month, they can start actively providing, like if we're too busy to train them or their trainer called out sick or whatever, they can process these tickets in the system asynchronously. They're contributing immediately. And I have some other comments we could make on that, but we actually use AI to train on call taking as well. but for 911. But this isn't. I don't think you need to train on. There's still plenty of calls that come through too, like our corner calls and all those calls. So I don't see that as a concern.
That's
And
what I'd
then-
say, a lot of calls that come through still. But the other thing is that they're getting experience and training on this technology. And I don't see this kind of going away. I just see this happening in more and more PSAPs as we move forward. So
And so the last thing I'll leave the audience on before my marketing team kills me is a health assessment. So we talked about this idea of like understanding, why are people actually calling and what could the impact be? One of the ways we do this is just taking call recordings, analyzing them, running them through the AI to see exactly how we would handle it. And this is something that we do with Chris after the fact. We probably should have done it beforehand. That we now do beforehand. It's just a way to get a sense of how much of an impact could call automation have. Whether you go with us or a different vendor, like how much can this actually help you? So feel free if you scan that QR code or go to our website and actually sign in, and you can see we can get the process started. And thank you all. I appreciate you taking the time to join our webinar. And special thanks to Chris and DT to come on and talk about, kind of in many ways, like the good, the bad, and everything in between about call automation, the things that they learned, and the things that hopefully will make it a little bit easier when you start this process, if you do.
All
Thanks,
right,
everyone.
that concludes our webinar. Thank you to our presenters, our sponsor, Aurelian, and everyone for joining us today. Thank you and take care.